Okay, our last speaker for this part of the session is Dr. Fielding, presenting the muscular system. Dr. Roger Fielding is a director and senior scientist of the Nutrition, Exercise Physiology, and Sarcopenia Laboratory at the Jean Mayer U.S. Department of Agriculture Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University. He is also professor of nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and policy and professor of medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine. Currently, he serves as the associate director of the Boston Claude Pepper Older Americans Independence Center. Dr. Fielding is an internationally known researcher who studies the underlying mechanisms contributing to the age-associated decline in skeletal muscle mass, the resultant impact on function, and the potential role of exercise, nutrition, and physical activity on attenuating this process.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you all for the invitation to speak to you today. Get situated with the slides here. I think one of the important things I'm going to try to impress upon you is that skeletal muscles actually really matter. Skeletal muscle tends to be an understudied organ in many respects, and when we think of older people, I think they need to understand that sometimes the problems they have getting around, the problems they have climbing stairs, the problems they have in getting up out of a chair are problems related to their skeletal muscles. And I don't think there's enough awareness about that, not only among us, but also among older people that we talk to. So I think it's worth remembering that this tissue actually makes up about 45 to 50% of our total body mass. Muscle plays a fundamental role in locomotion, energy metabolism, substrate turnover, and storage. There's really exciting emerging evidence that it's also a secretory organ now. It secretes many secreted proteins that have been termed myokines, and they have pluripotent functions with other tissues. And I would argue that robust skeletal muscle is a central factor in whole body health and essential for maintaining energy homeostasis. The other thing I forgot to tell you, and I was going to start by saying, and I thought it would have already been said by now as this was a conference on aging and nutrition, is that we have more people worldwide and on our planet that are over the age of 65 than ever before in the history of mankind. And that's an astounding thing to think about, and we really need to pay more attention to the health and behavioral needs of older adults. And implicit in that is really understanding the role of nutrition. And the other thing that's forgotten, I think, and maybe it was mentioned in the very first presentation, and I might not have caught it, but the fastest growing segment of the older population are individuals over the age of 85 years. So not only are we getting older, but we're living to older and older ages. And I think there are a lot of nutritional and other healthcare needs that need to be addressed, particularly in that old population. But now back to muscle. So motor proteins and motor functions are ubiquitous across all species. This is just not a unique problem to humans. Fruit flies, birds, fish, canines, and humans all have motor proteins, and mobility is a ubiquitous function across all species, and it's associated with lifespan. We can look in rodents, we can look in C. elegans, we can look in fruit flies, in Drosophila, and this is just the sort of lifespan of the Drosophila here, and you can see that the flight index, the measure of flying capacity, declines as they age, and the loss of flying capacity is associated with mortality, even in fruit flies. And this is true in humans. If we look at things like walking speed or the ability to walk a quarter of a mile, it's closely related to mortality in humans as well. There's also an implicit increase in healthcare costs with mobility declines in aging. This is data that Susan Hardy published a few years ago now, looking at healthcare costs from the Medicare beneficiary rolls, looking at self-reported ability to walk in individuals who report no difficulty, some difficulty walking, or are unable to walk 400 meters or 1/4 of a mile. And you can see that mean annual healthcare costs go up with increasing difficulty of walking, and rates of hospitalization also go up as well. So this is not only related to mortality, but it has an effect on society in terms of the ultimate costs to the healthcare system and the economics. This is data from the US, but I suspect these trends would hold up in many other parts of the world. Now, we believe, and I believe, that skeletal muscle changes with aging are central to many of these changes in mobility and function. The term that we have given to this, and this has been around for about 20 years, is sarcopenia, which really is defined presently as the age-associated loss in muscle mass and function. And before I sort of try to define that for you or tell you what the evidence is about what sarcopenia is, I think it's worth looking at muscle and getting some sense of this. These are CT scans, or computed tomography scans, from some research participants from our own laboratory. This is a 70-year-old woman with a BMI of about 23, so normal BMI. And this is a mid-thigh CT scan. So, and these are digitized images. So the red here is the fat that's right under our skin, or the subcutaneous fat. The white is the long bone here of the femur. The blue area here is all what we call normal density muscle. And the green is low density muscle. And the density is really a measure of the optical density when we densitize these images. Normal density muscle has less fat. Low density muscle has more intramyocellular fat associated with it. And then we have one other tissue here. That's the intermuscular fat, which is illustrated here in orange. So you can see in a 70-year-old woman with a normal BMI, most of the muscle is normal density. There's a little bit of low density muscle and a little bit of intramuscular fat here. Now contrast that, now this is only one image, but I think these trends are very representative. Contrast that to what we see with an 85-year-old woman here. Again, this is a CT scan through the mid-thigh. Much less total muscle cross-sectional area here. The majority or much more of the muscle here is low optical density muscle that has more intramyocellular fat. And we begin to see much more accumulation of intermuscular adipocytes or intermuscular fat accumulation here as well. So this is a very characteristic set of images that we see in people as they age. I also want to point out that these are examples of community-dwelling, ambulatory older women. These are not patients. These are not institutionalized or hospitalized patients in any way. Now, muscle is important because it's related to strength, or the force generator, the maximal force generating capacity of our muscle. This is data, again, cross-sectional data from our own laboratory in about 100 older men and women, looking at the relationship between total muscle cross-sectional area from the thigh, again from those CT scans, and the maximal force or muscle strength that can be generated by the knee extensor muscles. And you can see that nearly 70% of the variance in muscle strength or force can be explained by differences in muscle cross-sectional area. So cross-sectionally, there's a close association between the size of the muscles here and the amount of force that they can generate. And that has implications for locomotion and other functional activities as people age. Now, when we look at this longitudinally, the relationship between force generation or strength and muscle mass is more complex. These are longitudinal data from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. And there's data also from the health, aging, and body composition studies that have also support this. And basically what you can see is when you follow people longitudinally, the declines in muscle strength exceed and occur at a faster rate than the declines in muscle mass. From about age 30 on, we see about a 1 to 2% decline in muscle mass or muscle cross-sectional area, again from CT scans, and about a 2 to 3% decline in muscle strength or force generating capacity. So there is more complexity here than just simply the close relationship between mass and strength that's revealed in these longitudinal analyses. I should also point out that there's quite a bit of variability around these data. So some people decline more rapidly in both strength and cross-sectional area than other people. Now, despite the high prevalence, and we'll talk a little bit about prevalence in a second, Sarcopenia as a clinical syndrome or entity still has no broadly accepted clinical definition. There really are no consensus diagnostic criteria, and because of that, and because of the lack of really standardized treatments or therapies, there are no treatment guidelines presently. In the past 10 to 12 years, there have been several renewed efforts to begin to think about defining sarcopenia as a clinical syndrome. There have been some consensus panels organized primarily in the United States and Europe, but even more now internationally. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those have found. But I think the most encouraging and I think important development in the area of sarcopenia as a clinical syndrome and entity is that as of next month, there will be established an ICD-10 code for sarcopenia, and that's really been the result of the Aging in Motion Coalition, which is based in Washington, D.C., and their efforts to establish an actual code for sarcopenia to begin to increase awareness for this syndrome in older adults. Now, with the emergence of some consensus definitions of sarcopenia, there's been about 5 published in the last 10 years. Generally, there's agreement across these consensus definitions. They've all indicated and included some objective measure of muscle or lean mass, like the CT scans I showed you. Some have also suggested using DEXA or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry or other techniques to measure muscle or lean mass. And all have recommended incorporating some measure of muscle weakness or reduced physical functioning into the definition. But regardless, these have all been consensus panels really based on expert opinion. Only recently has there been evidence-based attempts to establish criteria for the definition of sarcopenia, and those really have resulted from this Foundations of NIH project that was conducted and published in 2014. What they did was they did a large pooled meta-analysis of several large epidemiologic cohort studies, mostly in the United States, and they looked at, they used card analysis to establish cut points for muscle weakness or reduced grip strength and appendicular lean mass measured by DEXA, and looked at how that predicted incident mobility disability as measured by the development of a gait speed below 0.8 meters per second. Okay, so this was a many thousand pooled meta-analysis that was done. And from that analysis, they developed these cut points: grip strengths, absolute grip strengths below 26 for men, below 16 for women. Adjusted for BMI, they would be below 1.0 for men or below 0.56 per women. And the same was true with body composition. They recommended an adjusted appendicular lean mass for BMI here, and then an absolute alternate definition of less than 19.75 for men and 15.02 kilograms per woman. You can see that there are differences in the gender cut points for men and women here from this analysis as well. So for the first time now, we have evidence-based objective criteria that are linked to some hard outcome, like loss of mobility. Now, what is the prevalence of sarcopenia among older adults? And clearly, with the 5 consensus definitions and the FNIH definition, the range of prevalences varies depending on the operational definition employed. As I mentioned, there are clearly gender differences in the distribution of sarcopenia. The prevalence in most analyses increases with advancing age, so that individuals over the age of 80, the prevalence is higher than compared to individuals over the age of 60. It depends on the population in which this is measured, and other things like existing health status, dietary patterns, physical activity, and other comorbidities will clearly affect the prevalence. And the data from the pooled NIH analysis suggests that this prevalence can vary depending on definition from 0.5 to 13%. And just to show you this was the analysis that was done looking at prevalence in the pooled analysis that was performed by the FNIH consortium. And you can see, depending on whether you use the FNIH criteria, the international working group criteria here, the European working group on sarcopenia here, and which criteria you use within those specific definitions. The prevalence varies anywhere from 0.5% to 13.3%. One other important point here when we're talking about objective cut points for sarcopenia is that it's clear that the prevalence of the syndrome goes down if you have multiple criteria to determine sarcopenia. For example, the European Working Group developed a criteria called severe sarcopenia, which included a low gait speed, a reduced strength by measure of grip strength, and a low appendicular lean mass here. And you can see that when you do that, when you restrict the criteria based on all of these criteria, the prevalence is very low. And I think one of the things moving forward is that there needs to be consensus around a universal single definition for sarcopenia. And there are initiatives ongoing right now trying to resolve these many definitions into one singular internationally accepted definition to sarcopenia. The other goal of this going forward will be to try to link these objective cut points to other more clinically valid hard outcomes like falls, like injurious fractures, and potentially even mortality. So I think we have some resolution around sarcopenia as a syndrome, but I think we're still moving in the direction of trying to objectively define it and have a universal definition that has more clinically meaningful relevance. Now, like many syndromes and diseases of old age, there are multiple factors that contribute to sarcopenia. These include, that affect muscle. These include changes in physical activity patterns. Loading, just like in the bone, has profound effects on whether skeletal muscle increases or decreases its size. There are changes in neuromuscular activation. Both the number and regularity of motor unit firing is altered with aging. There are well-described declines in many of the circulating pro-anabolic hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1, and other growth factors that decline with age. We heard already this morning about the low-grade inflammation, the increase in many of the pro-inflammatory cytokines that occur with advancing age, and it's well known from both basic and translational studies that these pro-inflammatory molecules have effects on activating transcription factors in muscle that activate the skeletal muscle atrophy genes and cause a loss in skeletal muscle mass. And we know that several factors related to nutrition, not just a decline in total energy intake, can influence skeletal muscle and may play a role in the development and etiology of sarcopenia. In terms of interventions and behavioral interventions, both nutritional and physical activity, I think the things that have been most frequently studied in terms of dietary interventions have been looking at the role of either dietary or supplemental protein intake, protein nutrition and adequacy. There's some emerging interest in the role of vitamin D in skeletal muscle health and function, in whether vitamin D intake has an effect in skeletal muscle. Some other micronutrients, I think that there have been some smaller studies performed in those that might induce reductions in inflammation, the antioxidants, and some of the selected B vitamins as well. We also know a lot about the role of physical activity and exercise interventions, both resistance exercise or strength training exercises, which is probably the most pro-anabolic or muscle building type of exercise training, but also, at least from observational studies, we know that maintaining aerobic exercise throughout the lifespan seems to protect or slow the rate of muscle loss. So that's an important thing. And then there have been some studies which have looked at these interventions in combination, multimodality interventions, and those have also shown some potential benefits in terms of either slowing or reversing the rate of muscle loss with aging. These are all potentially important targets for therapy, but they also may be important modifiers to consider in responses in pharma trials. There's an emerging interest in muscle biology in the pharmaceutical industry and trying to develop specific pharmacologic targets that target skeletal muscle. So I think in the future, we may see things like diet and nutrition be used as preventative therapies and physical activity, but then sarcopenia may become so severe that there may be a need for pharmacological intervention, and just like in the bone field, that there may be recommendations about pharmacologic therapies in combination with diet and exercise interventions. Protein has a central role here because we know that the balance of protein synthesis and degradation really can regulate skeletal muscle mass. And there is some evidence that at least in some populations of older adults, the adequacy of dietary protein is lacking. There is some epidemiological evidence for a relationship between protein intake and change in muscle mass with advancing age. And that makes sense because the substrates for protein synthesis come from the free amino acid pool, which comes in part from breakdown of proteins, but also from proteins provided, amino acids provided in the diet. Let me just skip over this. I think this data, this observational data is really important. This is data from Denise Houston and the Health ABC study. You can see that in the range of fairly normal protein intakes by quintiles here, when you follow people over 4 years of follow-up, those individuals that are consuming in the low normal range here have an accelerated rate of appendicular lean mass loss compared to the other quintiles. So that's even within the normal range. So I think this whole issue of what is the appropriate protein intake in older adults is very controversial. The methods to assess this are challenging, but it does appear that if we want to optimize and minimize our changes in lean mass, the adequacy of protein in the diet is one approach that can do this. I don't want to say anything more about nutrition except that vitamin D is also probably important. This was a small pilot study that we did with Lisa Seglia and Vestas and Hughes at Tufts, showing that in postmenopausal women that were insufficient for vitamin D, if we supplemented them with 2,000 international units per day of vitamin D for 4 months, we did see a significant increase in the cross-sectional area of their muscle fibers. And this was particularly true in the type 2 fibers, which are the fast, glycolytic, high power, high force generating fibers, and these are the ones that we tend to lose when we age. This is a preliminary study, but I think one that's very exciting in terms of thinking about vitamin D and its role in muscle health, and I think we're going to learn more about this going forward. Just to summarize, and I think what's important here is that we're really beginning to understand that muscle is important throughout the lifespan, and that sarcopenia is the age-related loss in muscle mass and function. And there appears to be several nutrition factors, particularly related to protein intake and some specific micronutrients that do affect sarcopenia progression. And nutritional interventions may play an important role in the prevention and treatment of sarcopenia. I think the thing that we don't know anything about yet that we will know soon is what the role of anti-inflammatory dietary patterns and specific anti-inflammatory nutrients are on muscle. And these may be really important to study in muscle in old age. So thank you very much.